Good morning. We are live this morning with Coleen Stevens Porcher. Thanks for joining us, Coleen. Happy post-Thanksgiving for everybody who celebrates. Good morning for joining us. Today we're discussing what happens when a child declares they feel misgendered. What's it like to parent a teen through a gender transition? What's it like to be family or friends of a family going through such an experience? Coleen has had this experience and she's going to share with us. But before we get to her story, we have a couple of housekeeping things. We are live on Tuesday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. If you are joining us at any other time, you are watching a replay. Coleen will answer questions and comments live this morning, but if you're watching a replay, she won't be able to do that. But you can dialogue with other people who are also watching the replay. Often there's a vigorous conversation online with those who choose to do that. So please feel free to engage no matter how you're watching with us. Good morning, Coleen. How are you?
Hi, good morning. I'm well, thank you. I'm very well. It's great to see you, great to be with you again, and to be able to speak with the members of your audience, whether they're listening to us live or they're watching this later on. So tell me how you'd like to do this.
Okay, before we start our conversation, I want to tell everybody that Coleen's family is featured in the movie For They Know Not What They Do. This is a film that explores the intersection of religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity in current day America. I've seen the movie. It's great. I encourage you to see it. We're going to post a link in the comment section, so feel free to access that link and check out the movie. That's my part.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So usually I identify myself. I'm Coleen Stevens Porcher. I have a transgender son, and let me explain what transgender means sort of broadly. And, people define terms and experience life, themselves. So I just want to also say that. And transgender people have a gender identity or gender expression that is different from the sex they were assigned at birth. That's the simple explanation. I'm not an expert. I'm an expert in that I'm a child, I have a child and I had this experience. I feel as though I'm learning and I'm always learning. And I think that's the beauty in our family is that we're open to learning and growing. So I hope this is helpful to somebody. I know we save lives by opening and creating space that's safe for people. Just this Thanksgiving, you mentioned Thanksgiving, I was hanging out with my son and his friends, and he brought together a bunch of people who couldn't go home for whatever reason, and I was learning as we were there. So just to say, there was a person who used pronouns of they and them. And I said, all right. And I kept forgetting. And I would say Mr. or Ms. for the different they and them pronouns. And I was like, oh my God, we don't have a gender neutral term for that. And I'm like, all right, you're not doctor or professor. That would make it easy. And so we kind of laughed and had fun because it was understood that this was in the spirit of love. And people can feel that. So just a quick biographical context. I identify as a person of African ancestry with other ethnicities thrown in the mix. I immigrated to the United States from the island of Jamaica when I was 14 years old, and I live in the tri-state New York area. I've lived in all three states, New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. So is Elliot, by extension. And I was married. My former husband is white, of French Huguenot ancestry, and he was born and grew up in the South, in South Carolina, and we both met in New York. And so we're this interesting combination, and Elliot comes in, and I think it's really important to share that kind of biography because we're not any one thing, and we're all complex, really interesting beings, and I think I wouldn't be doing justice to Elliot and who he is if I didn't really emphasize that, because this is one aspect of him as a complex human, So we were a definite interesting combination as a family. What we had in common is we definitely love science and nature, and my gifts were language and people and the desire to make the world a better place. His father was an artist and runner and worked in the art field, and who was very creative, like artistically, but loved to play with language. Elliot was born in New York City, and this is going to become important later on, depending on what we talk about. But soon after, we moved to Connecticut, where we had purchased a house, and we lived there for 6 years before moving to Montclair, New Jersey. And a little bit about Elliot, as a child, because they don't become teenagers, all at once, right? He was a child that liked to draw and paint, and he would look for bugs all the time, any kind of critters, loved to swim, and loved to go on outings. And I would blame my former husband, Harold. I'm like, oh my God, it's your fault. Just everything had to be an outing or an adventure. And so they would just exhaust me sometimes. They were both ADHD, wicked smart. And Elliot, same thing, really smart, would scarf down books. Like I couldn't get him enough books and things to keep his mind stimulated. If he could play 24 hours a day, like any kid, he would. And our big work was ensuring that there was balance in the house, as much as you can be balanced having a household with children and being a working mom or being working parents, making sure there was discipline. And my son tells me now as an adult, oh no, you're a Black mother. And I'd laugh and I'm like, what does that mean? But he's like, you were very clear about what lines could be crossed or not. And you were fun, but you were just like, okay, there's going to be respect in this house. And what he also understood was that it was important to do well in school. And what I tried to instill in him was something that I grew up with, and I don't know the root of it, so I hope it doesn't have some bad history. But the motto was business before pleasure. You had to get work done, do all that you needed to do before you could have fun. And what happened was around between 6 and 9, I would say, was when Elliot, like there were signs, it wasn't like all at once. There were little things. There were things he would say to Dad or say to me, and he was very close to his dad. And I'm not going to lie, in every family, like there were times that I would get so jealous of them because it was like there were things that they could do together and they were alike. And I was kind of different, the two artists, the creative people, the wild, energetic people, But what his dad remembered, it was somewhere between 6 and 9, was that he said, would you still love me if I were a boy? And it's funny because he said it to me, but like, I don't have that memory. What I had was more sort of the everyday taking care of him and the combing of the hair and the things that I associated with female gender that like he hated combing his hair. And in the Jamaican language, my sisters and brother, well, you're picking nasty, to say that doesn't want to get their hair combed and all of that. And I would just ignore all of that, just was like, oh, my child is tender-headed. But we really began to see changes around middle school. And middle school is when a lot of interesting things happen. You had a program on with this, your teen, where it talked about adolescence and when it begins. And I'm not surprised. I would say we definitely experienced, you could see from around 5th grade when changes started to happen. So, and, he began to get treated badly. He was bullied and I didn't know it. He didn't tell me till much later, even though we had this very open communication and household. Like there were still things he kept from me, which I will tell you was shocking for me. But what happened was there was one teacher, and, in hindsight, I can look back and see it. She clearly had a sense of how girls should look and dress. And I would say that it was coming from a more traditional sense. But what really came out was that it was that like, oh, the child isn't being really taken care of and how do they look? And it infuriated me because I remember thinking it's not about how people look, how is he doing in school and all of that. And I know I'm saying he all the time because in my mind, while my child presented a different gender back then, it just is easier and less complicated in speech, in thinking of his identity as this is who you were, even though we didn't know it. So what I would say in the early time, he presented as what we sometimes call gender nonconforming, or what the common term people might use is, oh, like, Elliot's a tomboy. I didn't have the words of gender nonconforming necessarily. Like, I learned a lot along the way, but I myself, I'm not like in a box, and I don't want to be in a box as a woman. I identify from a gender perspective as definitely cisgender, meaning, I'm a woman and I identify as a woman, and I'm okay with that. But I don't want to. I think everybody wants to be who they are and to express themselves as they are. So what was interesting as part of that journey, and you can, stop me at any point and ask a question, but like where I'll, as part of sharing the background is, when he began to struggle and have challenges, like he knew his dad, he knew me, and he knew that like we were science people, we liked evidence, we liked research. And so he did homework. Remember, I said he loved books and reading and stuff. So he came to us with stuff. Here's what I'm thinking, sending me articles. So like he was sort of planting the seeds. And,
How old was he then?
he was in 6th or 7th grade. This was now after 5th grade. So 6th or 7th grade, saying, I don't feel okay. I don't feel like myself. And so right around 7th grade was when we got him in. We found a therapist that was a family therapist, because it was a family, we were having challenges as a family regardless, around adolescents and teens, and and so we thought, okay, well, this will be work as a family. It's not like Elliot has a problem. Like, this is a challenge that we're facing all together, and we're going to work on all of this together. So sometimes the therapist would meet with me, with just Harold, or with all three of us.
Okay.
So that was about how, so I would say 7th to 8th grade.
Okay, I'm going to put a comment. We have a comment from Kathy. She's responding to you. She says it would infuriate her too if someone suggested her child was not taken care of. We agree, Kathy. If the teacher has a concern, there should be a conversation, not judgment.
So it was done in a conversation, but like, I guess what I saw was, I could see that it was like, there's a worldview. And so I guess my worldview was like, let children figure things out. And for me, whether, if your shoes are tied tightly and you're look presentable, like on the outside, and you're not loved, and, then like, honestly, no matter how good you look on the outside, like what really matters is that you're confident, that you are loved, that you're treated with dignity and respect, and none of that matters. So I think that was why it bugged me also, because I knew how much I like invested in sort of time, energy, and resources in my own child. And I thought about what I had inherited as a child. So for me, it was like light years. And so that was also part of what was going on. But back to the therapist really quickly, is we were working with a therapist. We did try to get help from our pediatrician, but they really weren't equipped. This was around 2010-ish. And there just wasn't anybody who could give us good information. So a lot of this we had to find out on our own. Okay, period. Go ahead.
No, that's wonderful. When we began, we do the pregame before we come online, and I asked Coleen to just tell us her story, because there's a lot to her story, and I wanted to make sure that we could get as much in as possible within our time frame. So that's why we don't have our usual back and forth questions, but I want to encourage anybody who's watching to please put up your questions and comments, because yours are essential. So you told us around middle school was when Elliot started coming to you and saying, with his empirical evidence and research, saying, I feel a certain way, which is wonderful. Kids are wonderful that way. I do want to point out, there's something that you said that is wonderful. You said you were explaining the reason why you use male pronouns for Elliot and Elliot's name, Elliot, even though those weren't the birth pronouns and names. And you said, because that's who he was, even if you didn't know it back then. And I think that that's important to restate, because a lot of people, that may help us, because sometimes we're just confused. And it's not, there isn't any malice. We want to be correct, but it's new. And we don't have all of the words and the terms. And so I like how you presented that you do that this way, because that's who he was. You just didn't know it. So
Right,
then when
right.
speaking in those terms, in those times, you now retrofit the pronouns in the name.
Yeah. And, it's a process, right? Like
Mhm.
for me, the switching to the name, shifting the gender, like I had time to do it. And there were family members and friends that we weren't with and they would forget. And
Mhm.
Elliot would get really mad. And I would try to lovingly, I understood how he felt and
Mhm.
I understood how I felt. And I'd say, Elliot, I'm your mom and I'm trying really hard and your dad is trying really hard, even though he'd be like, he's not trying hard enough. They have to have somebody to fight with. Remember, we're dealing with teens because that's the other thing, right? You're dealing with a teenager that's rebelling on multiple fronts. And that's why I started out with, we're complex beings. We're not any one thing. This was just one aspect of who he was. So I
So
just wanted to explain that a little bit
let's
more.
talk about who you were,
Mhm.
because we're parents. This is your team for parents, and this is
Mhm.
new terrain. You have a child that comes to you. They feel misgendered, and they want to take steps to correct that. Explain to us how you felt and then what happened afterwards, because often we believe we must have a certain response to things, but really any response you have is an okay response. It's what you do afterwards. So what happened with you?
So I was surprised, I was stunned, like meaning it was one thing to express your gender, but like when he was like, "Oh no, not just express and being," and in the movie, you saw it, I was like, "Well, okay, you can express yourself as a man or male, like why do you have to change your gender? Help me. I don't understand it." A lot of it was I just didn't understand.
Yeah.
And so that was my difficulty initially. Like what I'd seen was what was on broad media, and I know that a lot of that gets manipulated, presented in a certain way there, and people have agendas. So and there wasn't anyone I could really go to, so I had to do my own research. So Elliot did his own research and helped me, like the international ILGA. That was where we started. There's an international group
Mhm.
um, on lesbians and gays, and they were looking much more broadly, like in terms of trying to influence countries and the UN, but it gave me a place to start to find general information.
Mhm.
And then from there, and I wrote some down. So just, I want to make sure I look, because I think this will be helpful to people. I then looked at the Human Rights Campaign. I learned about
Mhm.
them. I also learned about the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. Like there are two different arms that do two different things. Um, and but I didn't necessarily start there. Like I started with the therapist, just trying to figure out, so what was going on. Like gender might be one thing, but
Mhm.
sometimes they're co-occurring issues. And Elliot was always Elliot is smart and super smart and always was doing well in school, and he wasn't doing poorly, but I could see that he wasn't engaged. I could see that he wasn't enjoying it. And honestly, as a mom, you want your child to be happy, and you want them, we live in a very competitive time. I wanted him to get into a good school. So whatever it was that we needed to address to help him. So in my mind, it was a problem to be solved, because that's kind of how I
Mhm.
approach things. And then I realized that like I was part of the problem to be solved. I was part of who needed to learn. And so we had sessions with the therapist, and after a year, maybe it was almost a year, maybe a little over a year of working with this one particular therapist, and the kinds of things that she mentioned. We went to the pediatrician. There was just a lot of back and forth with different practitioners, and I just was not feeling satisfied. In addition to going and looking at some of these places. At the time, I didn't think about and look at PFLAG. That was another organization that came later.
Mhm.
Um, but what I started to do when the therapist we were working with, and God bless her, because she was honest and she said, I'm beyond my depth. I want to be able to help Elliot and you, but I don't think I'm equipped. And I'm not gonna. I panicked. I was like, "What?" Because she was sort of our person holding our hand, just someone we could talk to that was neutral ground for me, neutral ground for Elliot, And so then I began to do what I was good at. I was trained in history. I was a history major. So I started to do my own research based on what I knew. I've always worked in NGOs, non-governmental organizations. So I began researching and I started looking for Children's Hospital. I started looking for places that dealt with matters around adolescence and gender. And funny enough, like I had to go all the way across the country. I started out with Los Angeles, the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. They had a whole program. And I don't remember the exact year, but bear with me. This might have been like, let's say it's the end of his last year of middle school. We're getting into high school now. So it was right in that transition phase. And I found they recommended me to a fellow, Dr. Matthew Oransky, who ended up going to Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. And they said, this is the person you should talk to. This is the person closest to you. And I'm very grateful to Dr. Oransky. Like, one, he was a psychologist by training, but this was an area of expertise. And you know how you have a conversation that like is life changing for you as a parent, as a mother or caregiver of any kind. I'm not going to assume that everyone's a mom or a dad here listening to us, right? I remember he said, what the thing to keep in mind is that it's about consistency, persistence and consistency. And so those were the things I remembered. And I will never forget it. It was like, oh, this has been consistent. It has been persistent. And to this day, he was like, that's how we know for sure. And he did acknowledge, he said, look, it's fluid. And I think my worry as a parent, and I years later said, you know, Elliot, I'm sorry because I did hear you. I could see, but my big fear and worry, and that was my own fear, and I own that, is like, what if you changed your mind? You know, like what if, like, because it's a continuum, and so if you change your mind and I gave permission and I had done the wrong thing, like I could never forgive myself for that either. So I felt really, as mom, and I think his dad would say that too, I felt we were caught in a rock and a hard place. And it is true that it's fluid, and some people may feel and present and they'll think, well, this is where I'm going. There have not been many cases where I've seen that. There have been one or two cases where they're like, all right, you know, and then they're like, well, here's where I'm landing. And that's okay too, you know? I mean, adolescence, as we know, the human brain is still developing, you know, up to your 25. Some scientists would say like, oh no, it's till you're 30. But the bottom line is, you know, their cerebral cortex, you know, is still developing. And so I knew that. And I felt like that was the one thing I needed to be responsible for. And at the same time, so I'm talking about this as though it's this one thing and we're going like this. But remember, there was school happening. We have to be thinking about like, okay, well, when you get to junior year and there are all going to be all these things, there's sports. And as this is all happening, we're dealing with institutions, right? So that was also the hard part.
The nitty gritty of I want to talk about that, the nitty gritty of dealing with institutions. For those people who are listening, I want to emphasize, you said that the psychologist you dealt with said, when you were wondering, you know, is this a phase or what, the psychologist said, are Elliot's concerns consistent and persistent? The feelings he's expressing, are they consistent and persistent? So that is something that parents and family members may want to consider when they're thinking, as you were, that this could change, because this is a young person and young people are evolving. Will it change? For those of you who may not have caught the distinction, the reason why Coleen was wondering how far she should go and how far Elliot should go is because Elliot wanted to transition from one gender to the other physically, not just in self-expression. And so that's where she was caught wondering, is she doing the right thing by allowing this to happen and allowing it to happen as a teen, and whether or not it was within her parental responsibility to say yes or say no. So that's what she was thinking about then. But I want to talk about, you talked about the institutions, because in our pregame, we talked about some things. And I think that it's interesting for people to hear something as simple as the name change. Tell us who picked Elliot's name and how the name change became an issue in New Jersey, especially with school records.
Sure. So Elliot loved the movie E.T. And so as a young child, I think he might have been 3 or 4. Like we had, you know how children are. I know you're a mom, so I can say that. And like they'll have you read a book 15 times or watch a movie 100 times. So E.T. was that and the baby movie. That was what he called it, the baby movie, how life became life. And so remember I said about his interest in science. So there was also the interest in art and music, and he loved music. And so we had a big school right across from us in Connecticut, Fairfield University, and they would have concerts. And so I think it might have been the Bridgeport Symphony Orchestra. So all the kids, all the families, we brought out our sheets, our chairs, you know, to hang out. And of course, the parents brought their wine, you know, and the children their toys and their appropriate libations. And what ended up happening was they would play just like the "Eek" or the "Eek, eek," you know, from the movie. And he was like, E.T. And he said that the first time. They did it again. He said it again. I was like, oh my God, he's right. So that movie and that child made an impression, and he loved that name, the sound of it. He has a strong sense of smell. His hearing is really finely tuned. He almost has perfect pitch, which means I can't sing in the house because he tells me when and how I'm off key, you know. But that was that for like, so that stayed with him, and so I guess so he identified with that name and how I guess how it sounds, how he felt connected to it. So you asked about like how he picked his name, but that didn't come till much, much later. Like that was, let's say, freshman to sophomore year. Sophomore year in high school, yes, was
So how did
when.
that affect? You told me some stories. I'm sorry. You told me
No,
stories
that's
about
okay.
how that affected when you did make the change. So we know he picked it from the movie.
Right.
When you did make the change, how did that affect school records and such?
So right. So what happened was, so he knew that that was the name he wanted. He chose it. And so we went to the schools and we were like, okay, this is the name he would like, but you couldn't do that. They had rules about it. Had to be on the birth certificate, and there had to be documents, and you couldn't just change your name in New Jersey. And the schools at the time, because it is different now, and you couldn't. We gave all kinds of doctor's notes. That was the other thing. Everything you had to have the paperwork. You know, we're dealing with institutions that are like all institutions. School institutions are quasi-governmental or governmental, depending on what state you live in, and so that was just not something that they were willing to do. And so then we started the process. Like, so the first part was on April 9th. He wrote a teacher to the principal, everybody, all the school people. And he said, you know, this is who I am. This is my name. I'm telling you. In fact, I put it, you know, he's like, this is an important matter that's going on in my life regarding my education, et cetera. He was very adult-like, you know, and he described for the teachers, he's like, this has affected me for the last 2 years. And I've come to the realization that, like multiple other students in this high school, I'm transgender. And I've decided that I want to be referred by a different name and different pronouns, Elliot and he, him pronouns. And he says, and if you're uncomfortable with the full switch, like here he is thinking about other people, you may use they, them pronouns. And he did say, because we had that hard process of coming to this decision comes with the full and unrelenting support of my parents. I will tell you, I weep every time I look back at that, you know, my parents, my peers, and my guidance from medical professionals. And so he basically asked them after spring break, I'd like you to start doing this. And thank you for reading this. And I hope you have a wonderful spring break with your family and friends. And I'm like, who does that? He's 15 years old. So I'm not going to apologize for tearing up. Emotions are who we are. And although we're in a really good place, you can't be human and not see your child hurt and not hurt with them. You just can't.
And the reason we brought that story up is that the name change may seem simple and non-consequential for someone who's not going through it, but it was very important to Elliot. So much so that he wrote this letter out of kindness, but also really asking people, please honor me the way I'd like to be honored. And that's one very small way that we can help people be who they want to be and shine. I have a comment we're going to put up.
Mhm.
Good morning, Victor. Victor says this is an interesting and insightful story. Thank you. Now we are nearing our end of our time. We always, when it's good, we go over a little bit, but this is what I'm going to do because I wanted
All
you
right,
to
no
get
problem. No
the
problem.
essentials out. We're going to do some rapid questions. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions
Mhm.
and you're going to give me short answers. And then if anybody has questions, this is your time to post them so we can answer those. What should schools and the broader community know and do if there is a student in their midst who's going through this? Just one or two things. We talked about the name change, how that can honor the person. What is one or two other things that helped Elliot?
I have to give them a few. Listen to the children, you know, find out about these resources. There's no excuse to be ignorant or unaware. We've given resources here. There are a ton of resources. Have an open mind and heart, have a lifelong learning approach. You know, there's a lot to be done, but there's simple things. Figure out a way that if your school systems, your computer systems, your hospital systems don't allow it, that you can have a way that people can let you know what their gender is or how they want to be called. It may, like, we're just this very advanced industrial nation. And so when I hear like, oh, well, we can't do that, it's infuriating. So figure out a way to do that at all levels. That's really, really important. Learn more. You know, I want to also remind people who are making a difference that every one of you count. Like the person who made that one of the biggest differences in Elliot's life was the person who took attendance. She saw him as a human being, understood his potential. You know, she saw him as the full person. That made a huge difference in his life. So every person out there who's an ally, let them know you love them, that you care, that you're there for them. Huge piece.
Okay.
So that's more than 3.
That's okay. That's okay. I want to point out to our audience that you'll notice we did not touch upon the medical insurance aspects of this story. That is for another day, because as you see, we could go on and on about this. But that is another really fascinating part of the Porcher family story, as the whole what it's like to go through this medical transition, all of the bumps and hurdles and et cetera. So I don't want you to think that we are unaware of it. We just today really wanted to speak from Coleen's perspective, what this was like parenting her child. What has the transition meant for Elliot? How has it affected him? I know in our pregame, you were telling me, you know, you've given us a picture of what he was like before. He was into science. He was very curious. What changes have you seen since the transition?
So he's a happier person. You know, all human beings, what we need to do, I think, as a society is help people self-actualize and really become who their full human potential, that what they're capable of. And when we don't do that, you know, then like we prevent the next best scientist, you know, or lawyer or whatever it is that the way it is that they're going to contribute in the world. So he began to have friends. Like once, you know, in school, he'd always been interested, as I mentioned, in the arts. And so he began to do more of that. Like once he felt like, okay, I can be myself. There were obstacles, but I can be myself. I can do this. He did very well in school, got into a good college. He's now looking at, you know, I think I want to do something around health law because of all his experience with insurance and with healthcare and what happens to vulnerable populations. So, you know, if that's what he ends up doing, or if it ends up being public health, because he was supported and helped, he is doing well and he's thriving and he's helping other people. And that's the key. It's like, you know, it's about paying it forward. He was always a kind child. He was always thinking about what he could do to help other people. And so I feel as though when you're not so focused on how awful your life is feeling, then you can take care of others. You can do good in the world. And so that, I think, that's been the biggest thing to see, is like I feel as though we had lost our child, and that who he was dying, and he became resurrected, and that we found him. And so that is the power of that. It's like that light that was always a part of him. We got that back. That's what's the difference.
And so that people understand, parts of the story we didn't touch upon is it wasn't easy peasy. It wasn't just that Elliot came to his family one day and we should do this and you went to therapy and everything turned out all right. There were some low times during that period before you reached where you are now. And so that's why I asked the question. And as you said, he's happier now. And that's what we all want as parents. But also, you told me during pregame that he's a leader now. He may have been smart and curious and articulate before, but now that he's really coming to his true self, he's opened up to become a leader and to help other people. And that is fascinating, that one part of him was not apparent before. Probably he didn't have enough energy. He was spending his energy other ways.
Correct. That's exactly it. Just when you're just trying to survive, when you're just trying to live, and that was a reality. Like they get so depressed, the numbers, and it's in the movie. So I want to encourage people to take a look at the movie too, or read the stats in terms of the number of young people who complete suicide as a result of this. It is extremely high. And so that is why I care, and why I want any family member that's aware of this or thinking about it. You have to make a choice, and so if you don't, you have to work with the children. It's really important to keep them alive, hold their hand through all of this. And that's part of what you do. So it's about Elliot's story, but it's bigger than Elliot. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than us.
Speaking of family, you have, and we are almost done here, you have a story. Can you share with us? There's a story that happened recently about, it wraps all this together about using the correct pronouns in names and et cetera, and family members and how you can support a family member. And the story is about your grandmother, when you recently visited your grandmother.
Actually, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
It was when I was driving on the Garden State Parkway, and just a quick before that, when she was 78 years old, I was a high-risk pregnancy, and she helped make sure Elliot came to be, coming up, cooking, helping me, because I had to be on bed rest. So that's the interesting through line through this story. And so this was hard for her. She had a gay son. She hadn't accepted him. And I remember thinking, this stuff ends with this generation. Like, I am not going to make any excuses for anybody, etc. And I love my grandmother. Like, she saved my life too. But I remember we would catch up with each other. As I was driving home, if she called, I would always try to pick up. And I'll never forget, she's asking, how is everybody? And she had a hard time with the new name, and had a hard time with the son and he and him. And I will never forget it, as I'm almost home, and she's always asking about all the grandchildren and the great-grand and the great-grand. And she said, how is Elliot? How is your son? And I still, to this day, I don't know how I kept driving. Like, I just had my hand on the steering wheel, like gripping it. And the tears were just coming down my face. I was weeping, because for me, it was like, I love you, granddaughter. I see you. I hear you. You might have been battling with me all along the way, but I see you and I love you. And I may not understand, but I'm here. And it was really, I don't know. I made it home, and then I really, like, gut-wrenching tears, bawled. She's 99 years old now. She's still alive and kicking, and and she still remembers. She'll say he and him. It's made a world of difference for me, because I love her. Right?
Yeah. She's 99 years old, and she can make a change. That's
Amen.
She can do it. We can all do it. If you knew then what you know now, what would you have done differently earlier in this process for your family?
So I try, just sort of generally, not to look back and have lament, because there are things there was so much information and so much to do. So that's one piece. So I wish I could have absorbed all of the information. If I could have seen, the one thing I think about at times is that if I could have foreseen what would happen with the election in 2016, I might have moved faster, because I didn't expect that at a federal level and at a state level, there would be things working against us. around name change, around getting a passport. So we were fortunate that Elliot was born in New York because I was able to do the name change in New York City. And then rapidly, but we still had to announce everything and do it in New Jersey because those were the rules. So it costs money. But there are organizations, like there's some equality organization in every organization, and Garden State Equality was a godsend. Like they held my hand, they held our family's hand, they walked us through what we could do. So we didn't have to start over. So if I knew about them earlier and had thought of them earlier, I would have done that. And just, I would have probably engaged and advocated probably sooner. Nobody can do this alone. And so that's a big piece of it, is find other families, however you can. Like I was not a big Facebook user. So that was another thing. So I much more about engaging. And so if I could have engaged with people sooner, because once I figured things out and I started to talk to other families, I found people where their children were having gender expression at an earlier age. Like, what would it have looked like if I'd known that sooner? I could have probably helped him better. And that's the thing that sometimes I'm like, gosh, I wish I knew then. But I know it now and I can tell other people.
Thank you for doing just that with us today, telling other people what you've learned so that they can be a step ahead in their process. We really appreciate that, Coleen. We are at the end of our time. We are a little over time, but that's okay. I know it goes by quickly. I want to thank everybody for joining us and remind everyone to join us tomorrow, same time, 10:30 a.m. Eastern time. Tomorrow, Wednesday, we will have coffee with Jen and Sharon. They are parents and they are on the Your Team Media team, and they are always talking about something that's relevant to our family. So please be here, have your own drink, 10:30 a.m. Eastern time. We have a comment that we're going to put up because it's a great way to end it. Tim Griffin says, thank you, Coleen.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Being with us. There are resources in the comments section. We're going to put some more up after this discussion. Please feel free to access those and join us again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
It seems to be caught in a loop. I don't know if we're still on air. Okay. It says having problem.